So, Jonathan, I know we've done this before, but still, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, sure. My name is Jonathan Weakley, and I am a researcher and practitioner based here in Australian Catholic University. I had the fortune of growing up in New Zealand, doing sports and exercise nutrition at University of Otago. Then I went to Australia, did a few masters, and did a master's in strength conditioning and also a master's in clinical nutrition, and then did my PhD with Leeds Beckett over in the north of England. And I was kind of working alongside the England Rugby Football Union, so RFU. And then I did my postdoc over there. And then I decided I was a bit cold and wanted to come back to sunny southeast Queensland, where I'm now based here in Brisbane. So living the dream in my opinion here, mate. It's a great place to be. And now, right now, I don't do too much teaching anymore, but I do primarily supervision of PhD students and honors and master's students. So just kind of leading the way into this strength and conditioning research and kind of it's primarily based around the research nowadays.
Nice, nice. So, I enjoyed our last conversation, and I read the paper you just published, and also the
Yeah,
paper about uh, velocity-based training.
sure.
I do love those things. So I know we discussed about velocity-based training in our last conversation, but still, can you uh can you give us uh an introduction about how are your thoughts on the traditional velocity zones, how you view that, and uh what are your thoughts on implement into reality?
Yeah, sure. So for those who don't know velocity-based training is a method of training which utilizes velocity to enhance training programming and physical adaptations. And there's three fundamental tenets of velocity-based training. Velocity-based training is based around the concept that as barbells get heavier, barbells go slower. As you get more fatigued, barbells go slower. And the most tricky of these three tenets is the last one, which is there is a terminal velocity for each exercise. And what I mean by that is each exercise has a V1RM or a velocity at 1RM. And it doesn't matter if it's the 10th rep of a 10RM, it's the 12th rep of a 12RM, a 1RM, the third rep of a third RM. The velocity is pretty much always the same. So in the squat, it's about 0.25 meters per second. And that's irrespective of the person, their training background, their age, ethnicity, height. It's always the same. So if we know that terminal velocity, the speed where you will fail, we can then start working backwards. So we can say you are this close to failure. And what that means is that we can use that information to mitigate the amount of fatigue that is induced in the athlete. Now, that's really, really important. We need to know how far our athletes are away from failure. But on top of that, we also need to know how far they are away from absolute failure, because that when you train at different velocities, you can have different physical internal responses. So physiological internal responses would refer to a metabolic response or your perception of effort. But then on top of that, we have different physical adaptations. Now, the first question you actually asked there was the traditional velocity ranges that have been used. So people often talk about, you know, um, speed strength and strength speed and absolute strength and starting strength and those sort of terms which are taken from Soviet literature. And I'm not here to debate the terms. What I'm here to say is there's been an oversimplification in the last 20 years that those broad speed zones that people tend to use are incorrect, because then they don't consider that the different exercises. What those broad speed zones, so you might see 0.55 to 0.75, that might be speed strength or something. strength speed. The thing is that that's for the squat and the squat only, because 0.48, 0.49 is the V1RM for the prone row. So you can't just take those ranges that have traditionally been thrown around and apply them to every single exercise, because those zones were specific for the back squat. So if you're going to use that sort of terminology and those sorts of concepts of zones, which is fine, you just need to be able to consider each individual exercise. And ideally, you'd take into account the individual load velocity profile. So some people have slightly steeper load velocity profiles. So load velocity profiles is load and velocity, so what speed you can lift a certain load, and then profiling them across a range of loads. And apply those zones to the individual and the exercise. So it's not to say that those concepts aren't really useful and really interesting. The issue is that we don't want to oversimplify it. Otherwise, you will just end up smashing people into the ground, or alternatively, not pushing them hard enough. For example, the bench press. The bench press has a 0.15 or 0.14 meter per second V1RM. Therefore, those zones which are often used wouldn't be hard enough. Where for the prone row, it would be far too hard. So we just got to make sure that we put the right zones and the right exercises for the right person.
Love that, love that. Before I did this, I had a conversation with a former sports science guy. He used to work with P3, and he's now gonna finish his PhD. Jacob Rauch, shout out to him. We have a discussion about the velocity-based training, and basically we have me and him have some same thought about like the force velocity profile is it like you mentioned that there's like speed zones, traditional speed zones that people used to implement, but nowadays it's more like probably the end point and the starting point for like the velocity is the same, but during the middle, everyone's different. Even it's the same exercise, everyone have like different uh load
profiles.
velocity profile.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why I'm kind of saying that you need to use the individual load velocity profile. There was great work by Sanchez Medina, Gonzalez Badil, and all those sorts of guys. And they were saying, oh, well, this is the same for everyone, plus or minus 0.01 meters per second. But it's not quite as simple as those individuals have said. There was an oversimplification. And that's only really been it's never been able to be replicated outside of their lab. So what we try to do is we have our own load velocity profiles realistically. But the thing is that it's not to say that 1RM testing isn't valuable. Actually, it's hugely valuable. It's just that can we also provide greater information? And the thing is that it's really easy to produce a load velocity profile if you're doing a 1RM test, because you're already getting up to 1RM. So you just plot the speeds before that. So, in my honest opinion, and I'm going to speak at the NSCA about this, is that if you are going to 1RM test people, great, awesome. We need that information. That's useful. However, we could provide a lot more information for our athletes by doing a load velocity profile as they're getting to that 1RM. And that's really good, because we know that true innovation is kind of taking two different things and putting them together to create something new. And if we take the load velocity profile, the information that we know we can get, and the 1RM, right, we can actually start to bring this information to be much more useful and more innovative in our training.
Love that, love that, love that. And last time we also discussed about like we used to use like the velocity loss as a threshold to monitor athlete fatigue. So can you like discuss about this at this time?
Yeah, for sure. So velocity loss thresholds, and personally, I like, and if you refer back to like my velocity-based training from theory to application paper, I talk about absolute thresholds and relative velocity loss thresholds. Now, absolute thresholds are hey guys, we're all going to train in the back squat and we're going to stop it when we hit 0.4 meters per second. Now that's good for masses. They group for big mass of people. But the thing is that if we want to be really, really perfect and we really titrate the volume and the dose that we're giving our athletes, we often want to use a thing called relative velocity loss thresholds. And a relative velocity loss threshold is 10% velocity loss or 20 or 30% velocity loss. So if I started at 0.7 meters per second in the back squat and I used a 10% velocity loss threshold, I would stop at 0.63. So 10% of 0.7 is 0.63. So your speed slow down, of course. And then if you want to do a 20%, 0.56, 30% would be 0.49. Now these relative velocity loss thresholds are so important. The reason for that, and we've shown quite conclusively in our literature, that if you do a relative velocity loss threshold, you can control the internal response. So the amount of neuromuscular fatigue, the amount of the metabolic response, and the perceptual response. And we've just put a paper under review, which is going to come out in probably 3 to 6 months' time, which will show that actually it can control the fatigue response at 24 hours. Because if you've controlled the internal response, you can control the subsequent fatigue response. Now, why that's important is because when you prescribe something as a coach, you're often guessing at what the fatigue response will be. Because if I said, hey, you and me are going to do 10 reps at 70%, we will slow down to different amounts. But if we control the velocity loss, we will control the fatigue response. Now, the beauty of the studies that we did was we did a randomized crossover control study, but we did a repeated designs. Now, I'm going to say something really complex here, but the thing is that in sports science, and strength and conditioning in particular, we have a replication crisis. We have never, ever been able to replicate the training response to a training program. Let me put it like this. If I give you 10 sets of 10 reps on the back squat at 70% at the start of preseason, you'll be bloody sore. At the end of preseason, you'll probably be fine. You'll be able to walk the next day. At the start of preseason, you're probably not going to walk for a couple of days. So even though I prescribed the same thing, you had very different responses. Now imagine if I was a doctor and you had a headache and you came to me and you said, Jono, I need some medicine for my headache. And I said, here, take 2 Nurofen. And then I whispered, it will probably fix you, but it might kill you. You'd probably go, I'm not going to take the damn Nurofen. So as sports scientists and strength and conditioning coaches, we need to think of our ability to prescribe like a doctor. Can I be confident that what I'm giving these individuals is going to cause the same response time and time again? And our studies showed that if you prescribe someone something with velocity loss thresholds, and then you get them to go away, and maybe 6 months later they come back and they've done whatever training they want in between then, and you prescribe the same training session with the same velocity loss thresholds and the same starting speed, the fatigue response is identical. And that is impressive because that is proper prescription. In S&C, we have never been able to demonstrate that. But we've done that with 2 studies now. We've shown that we can prescribe things, control the starting speed, control the finishing speed, and have the exact same response. Now that's science, that's strength and conditioning. Just prescribing some random training program and reporting on the fatigue response isn't science. That's just guessing. You know what I mean? And let's be honest, if you've got $1 million athlete, which most athletes, good athletes worth their salt are nowadays, and you're just guessing, and you're not confident in what the fatigue response will be or the potential likelihood of their internal response, you're negligent. You're negligent. We need to be able to be confident in our fatigue and internal responses. Yeah, so we've got 2 studies which have actually done that, and they're the only 2 studies in the world which have demonstrated that we can have the exact same response irrespective of training background and training history. That's real science, eh? That's really cool. So I'm really pleased with that, and that's why velocity loss thresholds are so impactful.
So we mentioned since last time we talked, last time we discussed about like velocity-based training,
Mm,
and also this time you talked about like the internal response. So
mm.
besides the velocity loss, is there other ways for coaches to monitor the internal response?
Um, well, uh, monitoring the internal response would need to be done in a scientific way. So, for example, monitoring blood lactate, neuromuscular fatigue, and perceptual responses. But I suspect the question is, can you mediate that response through other methods outside of velocity? And the short answer is yes. The long answer is not well. So if you use repetitions in reserve or RPE, you can mitigate or moderate, the amount of fatigue that is induced and the internal response that is induced, because we know that as barbells slow down, people also rate the exercise harder. So therefore, you can use subjective methods of auto-regulation, such as RPE and reps in reserve, to moderate that internal response. The issue with that is that they're subjective methods, and what you rate an 8 out of 10 might be different than what I rate an 8 out of 10. The thing is with velocity, it doesn't lie. Velocity is velocity. There's an objective method of auto-regulation. And we're showing in a recent study, I've got an honors student named Nick Cowley, and he's going to be an absolute superstar. And he's doing a current study which compares velocity-based training versus reps in reserve versus RPE versus traditional percentage-based methods. And while I can't believe we had to go do this study, we are, because what I mean by that is we're having to show that fatigue is a real thing. When we look at the NSCA textbooks, they often go, oh, do 5 sets of 10 at 70% of 1RM. Yeah, but in the 5th set, it's no longer 70% because you're tired. You've done 4 sets prior and you're fatigued. Therefore, the barbell's getting heavier and heavier and heavier. So that 5th set doesn't feel like 70%. It feels more like 80%. And what we're showing in our study is that you cannot do what the NSCA textbook tells you to. Therefore, we need auto-regulatory approaches to training. And what we showed is with the traditional, what the NSCA textbook tells you, by the end of that 5th set, the barbell feels like and correlates with the velocity of 85%. So think about this. If you start at 70%, and by the 5th set, you're training at 85%, has the barbell got heavier? No, you've just gotten more tired. You've gotten more fatigued. And we're having to show that fatigue is a very real thing and that we need to account for that in training. And that's why we have RPE and RIR and VBT. So as a long answer to your question, can you moderate fatigue with different methods outside of velocity-based training? Of course. It's just that they're not as accurate as VBT, because VBT, or velocity-based training, is objective. And that's the key to it.
Nice, nice, nice. So does that mean that when I pro like when I aim for like 70% today, probably the first set and the last set, the weight's gonna be different, but the speed are the same, am I right? Or the starting point and the end point are the same.
If you put like this, there's a reason why we do standardized protocols before 1RM testing. It's because if we do a whole lot of exercise the day before, you're not going to squat as much or bench press as much, right? So the thing is the 5th set is going to feel heavier than the 1st set. Obviously, you're tired, and that's okay. So technically, it's no longer 70%. It's 70% of when you were fresh. And realistically, what athletes train when they're really fresh. So the thing is that maybe you might need to take a little bit of load off as you're going, or maybe you need to account for that fatigue. And perhaps you need to go, okay, I'm a little bit more fatigued towards the end of the session. Maybe I need to moderate these lows a little bit. if you have VBT, you can just look at the first rep's speed and then just exercise down to the last rep speed. And you just need to make sure those speeds are consistent across the sets.
Nice, 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 nice. So I know there's the new paper coming out. There's a new paper coming about like
Yeah.
testing, and
Yeah.
I do enjoy that one. So can you like uh first of all like the beginning of like why what are the thoughts on doing this like this kind of like paper, the topic?
Yeah.
Why choose this one?
A couple of reasons actually. I at the start of this podcast, I say I don't do too much teaching anymore, and I probably undersold there, but I occasionally teach into one subject, and it's a master's subject, MHPS at ACU, and I found that students really struggled with testing. Why do we test? What outcomes? What tests do we select? But more than that, I consult for several professional NFL teams, so American football teams, and some of the sports science going on left a lot to be desired. And they didn't know why they were testing. They were just doing arbitrary tests for no real reason. And they were saying, oh, well, we're doing this for this. And I'd be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? So I, rather than complain about it and just kind of pack a sad and just kind of be a bit of a lump about it, I decided to try and get my thoughts on testing onto paper so that we can help the profession as a whole. Testing is fundamentally a simple concept. We test so that we can make our athletes bigger, faster, stronger. But we need a reason for those tests, and those tests need to be interesting and useful. And that key second word is useful. And to make those tests useful, we have 3 criteria. Can you use the test to rank your athletes? So what I mean by that is if everything else is held constant and the different physical, and they have strength, which was different, and they were a rugby league athlete, let's say, well, you would pick the athlete who is stronger. If they had the same skill set, same speed, same height, same mass, you would pick the stronger athlete in that instance because they are more likely to be able to tolerate the demands of the game. You know that the strength is really important for rugby league, for example. For an American football player who's a wide receiver, if everything was held constant between 2 athletes, you would pick the athlete who is faster because we know speed is very important for a wide receiver. So what we can say is that athlete is better. So we're ranking those 2 athletes. The second idea is we want to be able to monitor them. We want to monitor our athletes with the test across time. And why we want to do that is because we want to see whether our training program has made them improve or gotten worse or stay the same. So we need to have a good, reliable test, which allows us to monitor performance. And the third thing is that tests should prescribe us prescriptive information. So a 1RM back squat, really useful. The reason being is because you can prescribe from a 1RM. An isometric mid-thigh pull, what do you do with that information? Like honestly, what even is the isometric mid-thigh pull? It's an isometric test of force expression, but we've recently done a meta-analysis which demonstrates that the relationship between dynamic strength changes and isometric strength changes are 2%. 2%. So if you get stronger dynamically, you can't even monitor with it because it might appear in the isometric test. And you sure as hell can't prescribe from it. Okay, try and prescribe from 3,000 newtons. What are you going to do with that? So what we need to be able to do is find tests which we can rank, monitor, and prescribe. And those are the secrets to be able to select and justify a testing battery. Hopefully that sums it up.
Yeah. So in the old NSCA textbook, it also discussed about like testing. So what are the main difference after you've done this paper?
I think compared to the NSCA textbook, I think realistically what that paper does is it simplifies testing and puts all the key fundamental concepts into a single place. It's like the velocity-based training paper. It's taking all this information and bringing it down into a user-friendly way. Now, a lot of people and a lot of coaches, in particular, they struggle with basic scientific concepts of validity, reliability, and sensitivity. And that helps you monitor and prescribe and rank athletes. Also, the NSCA textbook doesn't necessarily talk about how we can maximize training data by taking different tests, technology, and outcome measures and bringing them together to provide an overall overview of the athlete. And there's some good little tidbits in there for how we can maximize the outcomes from our testing batteries. So, obviously the NSCA textbook is just that, it's a textbook. Well, this manuscript was written with a coach and student-friendly approach. So it's very, very applied.
Yeah, and I love the is it flow chart? Decision tree.
Yeah, the flow chart, yeah, the decision,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
the
love that
decision tree.
one.
Yeah, thank you, mate. It's I was sitting there and I was like, man, I just need to like if you've ever read a paper of mine, you might notice that I'm really sticking on two things, like figures and photos, like the images, and also like key take-home messages, because coaches don't want to read things; they just want to look at something quickly, read it one sentence, and go. And I was sitting there at home and I was like, mate, I need to make this simpler. I made a flow chart and I was like, do you understand the test? No. Do you understand the outcome measure? No. Do you understand the validity, reliability, sensitivity of the measure? No. And if it was no, it just goes, don't use the test. Yeah. And if you can get through all these questions and you get to the end, does it have prescription ranking? Is it a reliable test? Is it, can you justify these outcomes? And you go, yes. All right. Yeah. Use the test, man. Use the test. But I honestly, I genuinely think that so many hours of athletes' time is wasted every year by coaches who test their athletes and do nothing with that data. They do nothing with that data. In my opinion, that's just a waste of time. They test that. They test for testing's sake. So I was just like, guys, let's just simplify it. Let's make sure you fully understand the concepts. Boom, 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 boom. Here we go. Okay. Let's do that test, or let's not do that test.
I love your thought process, and I also love there's a note in there to just simply tell you how to like put in how to put the test in the right order. I
Yeah,
love that
yeah.
note.
Cheers, man. It was like on a coaching board, yeah. And like all those figures, I had little different versions, or I had like a coach on ones on like like holding it and another version of it. But yeah, like if you want to lose the validity of a testing battery quickly, do it in the wrong order. Before you do your sprints, do a maximal endurance test. And I see this stuff. I literally see this stuff. It's like mind blowing. Like people who are running major organizations have poor understanding of energy systems, and therefore they do the testing in the wrong order. And you're like, guys, like, what are we doing? Like they might do some exercise before they do the body composition, and all their skin fat, so body fat composition, all their body composition data is now incorrect. Like, obvious sort of stuff. That's first year sort of sports science sort of stuff, but we struggle with it and we keep on struggling with it. And therefore someone needs to make something that is coach friendly, user friendly, and you can just pick it up and go, all right, cool, here we go. So that was the thinking behind it. It should be a great resource for undergraduate and postgraduate students. And hopefully coaches can just put it up on their wall and go, oh yeah, cool, let's go for it.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to understand. I love that one. I love that one.
Thanks, brother. It's all my papers. Like there's obviously the hardcore like physiology papers I do, or the biomechanics sort of papers that I do. But at the heart of it, I've noticed one thing: the papers that get the most interest in sports science are the papers which are the most simple and provide the most information in a coach-friendly way. So, sorry, let me play it by simple. They simply explain a topic. You can have really complex arguments simplified. And I think it might have even been like Einstein or someone who said, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. So the thing is that, testing can be complex, but if I can't explain it simply, I don't understand it. So yeah, so let's try and make sure that we get these tough scientific papers simplified so that the masses can understand them. And they're the papers that often are best received. Velocity-based training from theory to application was the highest read paper in the world in sports science and medicine in 2020 and 2021. Like, that's a wild fact. That's a wild fact. I got some nice little award from ResearchGate. That, what that shows us is that these topics are very popular, and they were done in a really coach-friendly way. So a lot of coaches were going and reading this sort of stuff. So you don't need to write in a really complicated way to reach the masses. Actually, that's a fast way to disengage with the masses. So I'm really, really pleased with those kind of papers that are quite user-friendly.
Yeah, I totally agree about like those are coaches just do tests for like testing, not really understand what they should do with data. So they waste a lot of time
Yeah.
just do testing.
Let's do it, man. And then they don't give it to and you'll see that little curve one I did in the figure. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
they give it to them like 6 days later. Imagine trying to give a coach, counter movement jump or fatigue like monitoring data 6 days after the training session. But you lose your job. And like
Yeah.
honestly, it's just what I'm like, and yeah, it's really interesting and also if the coach doesn't notice that you haven't given them the testing data, it means that they don't care, which is a real concern, which means that you're dispensable. Not indispensable, you're dispensable. If you're doing stuff and no one cares about what you're doing, they probably don't care about you. So the
Yeah.
thing is that providing that information quickly and efficiently makes that information far more powerful and useful. And when I was working with sports teams, and I still have to pull this out every so often if I'm consulting, is that I try and catch the coach when they're vulnerable. So I might just be after they're coming out of the shower or something and go, yeah, here's the outcomes from that testing. You know what I mean? And we try and do it efficiently. You know what I mean? So the thing is that you can get the coaches there for 10 minutes and give them that feedback. But the thing is that make sure that whatever you do, get that information to them efficiently. Because if they don't have that information quickly, it quickly loses value.
Yeah. So the next thing I want to discuss is about like I noticed that you did a podcast with uh Matt Solomon, right?
Yeah, he's a great guy. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know you discussed about like impulse and power development. So
Yeah.
first of all, like can you like for those coaches who aren't that like familiar or who aren't that like yeah, familiar is the word with
Yep.
impulse force. What is the difference between force, impulse, and power?
So power is force times velocity, or in other words, the rate of work done. So the amount of mechanical work done within a time frame. While force is the amount of force applied in an elapsed period of time. Now, one is a fluffy metric and one is impulse. So the thing is that impulse has a direct relationship with momentum. That's why it's called the impulse momentum relationship. And the thing is that if we know Newton's laws, that equal opposite reaction. And this is why impulse is so important, where things like power are very fluffy. Amount of mechanical work. Try and explain that to a coach. What's mechanical work? So you can't really use power. Power is such a fluffy metric, where impulse has direct implications for athletes. If you are producing the same amount of impulse as me in half this amount of time, guess who's going further? You. If I'm producing impulse, same amount of impulse as you, but in 3 times the amount of time, I'm not going very far at all because that impulse is just dissipating to an extent. So the thing is that we need impulse to help propel us because that's force in a period of time, and that force into the ground or against an object helps cause momentum. So yeah, so it's really, really, we've had an overall too greater emphasis on power and not enough emphasis on impulse. But I will just note, if you talk about impulse to coaches, they'll just switch off. You got to
Yeah.
think about terms that the coaches use. So power is probably the key thing for you to use and to keep on thinking about. So yeah. So that's impulse and power simplified, I think.
So I also have the um same thoughts about like coaches or like sports science of talking too much about like the power
Yeah,
instead of like impulse.
sure.
So
Yeah.
for testing, let's say like force play testing, what are the like some metrics you gonna look at when it comes like vertical jump?
Yeah, I think it really depends. So first and foremost, you've got to make sure that they're reliable, um, and that they have sufficient sensitivity. Because if I did 3 counter movement jumps, the first jump might be 40 centimeters, the second jump might be 42 centimeters, and the third jump might be 38 centimeters. So you need to, whatever you do, just make sure that the test outcomes are reliable. So counter movement jump's pretty good. Personally, I don't really think about things like mean force or peak force. The reason is because that's dictated by mass. So mass times acceleration is force. So if I'm bigger, I can influence my force. Um, and if I'm going to calculate things, I need to make sure that I'm calculating them in the right way. So I have never really understood why someone would use a force plate and use flight time or takeoff velocity to calculate jump height when we know that the impulse momentum method of calculating jump height is accurate and it cannot be tricked. Flight time can be influenced by just bending your knees or flexing your ankles. Takeoff velocity isn't necessarily always accurate because if you need to do some calculations to calculate velocity because you're calculating it from force. Where impulse momentum cannot be lied about. That is the outcome. So the thing is that it needs to be reliable, and insensitive, and it also needs to be calculated correctly. Personally, things like counter movement jump counter movement jump height are the go-tos for me. But you can also do a range of things like impulse at certain time frames. You could do flight time, contraction time, although there's some sensitivity issues with that. I think it's interesting to report things like wattage per kilogram, but the thing is that again it's a bit of a fluffy metric. And if I was a coach, I would be identifying what it is that I need to reflect on and just going after that. I see a lot of coaches using metrics that they don't understand. And from my standpoint, I think that's a little waste of a time. So it really depends on what you're trying to monitor and how you're trying to monitor it and the aims of the project or the intervention, and then selecting the right variables based on those kind of categories, on those tenets of reliability, sensitivity, and valid methods of calculating them.
Nice, love it. I I always learn a lot from our conversation. I learned a
That's
lot
good.
from our last conversation, and also I learned a lot from you this time.
Oh, thanks, mate. It's yeah, no, it's good, mate. And like what we're trying to do, and what we should be trying to do as academics, is not overcomplicate what should be a simple concept. S&C, as I said, is a simple concept. Bigger, faster, stronger athletes who are performing better. And unfortunately, I think in academia we tend to simplify things. Complicate things when they should be simplified, and we should be working alongside coaches rather than isolating coaches and making them turn off. So it's a good compliment to receive. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, and for those who are interested in velocity-based training or like the testing manual you just mentioned, where can they find it and where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, sure. So the best place to reach out to me if you want to have a proper dialogue would be emails. I can't find social media. It's quite hard to get like convey your the tone or the actual context well. But of course, please reach out to me on Instagram, Jonathan_weakley_PhD, or Twitter, Jonathan Weakley with one at the end instead of a Y. But you can reach out there. But emails is if you're really interested and want to have a good dialogue and consult on, if you're a coach from a sporting team and you want consultancy, emails is the best place to get me because I can give you a proper answer and we can catch up online. So yeah, that's the best place. If you want to read some of that work, I think ResearchGate is probably the easiest place. Although I tend to try and make as many of my papers open access as possible. So but ResearchGate, you'll be able to kind of find my name and kind of find the papers that I'm doing. So yeah, and hopefully a lot of them are online.
Yeah, cool.
Awesome.